Buried in the archives of a South Carolina courthouse, there exists a single page that county officials tried to burn 3 separate times. Each attempt failed under circumstances the records describe only as irregular. The document lists 47 rules that governed entry into one man's home between 1821 and 1847. These were not household courtesies, but mandatory rituals. Rule number 12 required every person crossing the threshold to submerge their bare feet in a copper basin filled with prepared water. Rule 31 demanded they recite specific phrases while facing eastward. Rule 43 is entirely redacted. The ink scraped away so violently the paper tore. Local historians have spent decades trying to understand why these rituals existed and, more disturbingly, why 17 people died attempting to complete them. The man who created these rules left behind 14 journals, but authorities sealed them after 3 research. Tonight, we piece together what really happened inside that house, and why those who entered it were never quite the same. Before we continue with the story of Evander Stapleton and the threshold no one could cross unchanged, make sure to subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Drop a comment and tell me what state you're listening from. I love knowing where our audience discovers these forgotten chapters of American history. Now, let's discover what awaited those who approached Stapleton's door. The rituals began at Hartwell Landing, 700 acres along the Edisto River, where Evander Stapleton, one of the wealthiest men in the Carolina Low Country, operated his rice plantation. Stapleton arrived in Charleston in 1819 with credentials from the University of Edinburgh in agricultural chemistry. Wheat in months, his rice yields far exceeded anything the previous family had achieved. Other planters mistakenly attributed this success to his Scottish farming methods. They were wrong. Stapleton operated according to peculiar principles, instituting what he termed systematic records of every task and interaction of the 109 enslaved people who worked the fields. But his true obsession was the threshold of his home. No one entered his house without completing his necessary preparations. Among the enslaved community, a woman named Danina served as head of the main house staff. At 41, she was partially literate and possessed a grim understanding of the plantation's crew. She had entered the house hundreds of times under the previous owners, but she understood nothing about what Stapleton demanded. The spring of 1821 was unusually warm. Stapleton summoned Danina for the first entry ritual under his new expanded rules. The copper basin waited on the piazza, filled with mineral-smelling water. Remove your shoes and step into the basin. Submerge your feet completely. Count to 30. You must count aloud. The water felt warm, carrying a slight tingling sensation. After counting to 30, she was told to face east and recite, I enter this house with clear purpose. I bring nothing hidden. I leave nothing concealed. The words felt heavy, creating an unspoken obligation. Stapleton, rapidly scratching in his notebook, allowed her to enter. Warning, the ritual is not symbolic. It serves a specific function. Those who complete it improperly face consequences. He did not elaborate. For 3 weeks, Danina and the other house servants performed the ritual without incident. They whispered among themselves, trying to understand his strange requirements. Then, on a Thursday morning in early May, something went wrong. Julia, another house servant, arrived at the basin, suffering from a slight fever and exhaustion. When she began counting, she stumbled, losing her place around 17. Stapleton commanded her to restart. When she reached 30, she tried to recite the phrases, but transposed to words, saying, nothing hidden before clear purpose. Stapleton's face remained expressionless, but he marked his notebook with such force that the pen nib tore the paper. You may not enter today, it told Julia. Return tomorrow. Julia, confused and worried, protested. Sir, I've got to prepare. ... Tomorrow, Stapleton repeated, the tone ending all discussion. Danina, unsettled by the sight, resumed her duties. That evening, Julia's sick daughter died. Though the physician attributed the death to lung fever, Julia was inconsolable, repeating only, I couldn't enter. I couldn't enter the house, and she died. Her conviction faltered Danina's own certainty. Julia returned to her duties the next day, but she moved through the house like a ghost, starting at every ordinary sound. 2 weeks later, Benjamin made his mistake. He forgot to count aloud while in the basin. Stapleton stopped him immediately. When Benjamin rushed the count out of nervousness, Stapleton's expression hardened, demanding each count be distinct and separate, 1 full second between each number. Benjamin was ordered to practice that night in the fields. His wife, Hannah, later found him rocking and counting endlessly in their cabin, his eyes open but vacant, as if he'd momentarily forgotten who she was. The ritual consumed him, earning him a reprimand in the rice fields. When he finally succeeded, he had developed a permanent, slight tremor in his hands. The enslaved community began calling the basin Stapleton's judgment. Danina watched with growing unease as Stapleton's rules expanded. By August, there were 37 distinct requirements, encompassing everything from the angle of facing east to the number of breaths taken. He began requiring the ritual multiple times a day. That summer, Danina's son, Marcus, began working as a house servant. He trained intensely to avoid the mistakes of others, but the complexity was now so extensive that even Danina had to consult the posted rules before each entry. The specificity became obsessive. One evening in September, Rule 39 was added. Those who enter must do so with the right foot first, stepping over the threshold in a single motion without touching the frame. The unseasonable cold of October arrived, demanding 16-hour days for the rice harvest. On the morning of October 19th, a new servant named Aaron arrived from Virginia. He quickly learned of the unique rules. Other servants coached him on the ritual, demonstrating the counting and phrases. Aaron's first attempt on his third morning was near perfect, until the final step. He stepped over the threshold with his right foot first, but his left foot brushed the door frame. The whisper of skin against wood was barely audible, but Stapleton heard it, making a sharp, violent mark in his notebook. "You have failed the threshold requirement," Stapleton said. "The ritual permits no second attempts on the same day. Return tomorrow." As Aaron walked away, Danina saw an expression on his face that was not anger, but fear. That night, Aaron couldn't sleep, moving restlessly and muttering the counting ritual over and over. His second attempt failed again when his foot brushed the frame. Stapleton raised the stakes. "Tomorrow you will complete the ritual 3 times in succession." The pattern spiraled. Each day, some small error occurred. After a week, Stapleton required 5 perfect iterations. After 2 weeks, 10. Aaron's health visibly deteriorated. He ate little and slept less, obsessively practicing the requirements. The other servants tried to help, only increasing his anxiety. On the morning of November 7th, Aaron attempted the ritual 15 times. On the 14th, he failed. On the 15th, he completed every requirement perfectly. Stapleton watched him approach the threshold, ready to step over it, and Aaron froze. He stood there, right foot raised, unable to move forward or backward, his body rigid with terror. Aaron lowered his foot without crossing the threshold. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't do it." Stapleton simply noted the failure by forfeit. The next day, Aaron would require 20 successful iterations. An hour later, Aaron was found, hanging from a rafter in the equipment shed declared a suicide. Danina, however, had noticed something unsettling in his final days. Aaron had stared at the main house with a disturbing mix of longing and revulsion, as though the house itself had become something he both needed and feared in equal measure. After Aaron's death, the ritual requirements grew more elaborate, numbering 43 by December. Performing them correctly now took nearly 15 minutes. The enslaved community adapted, practicing the requirements obsessively, helping one another memorize the sequences. It became a collective effort of survival against a form of control more insidious than physical violence. Danina noticed that Stapleton never performed the ritual himself, and that he was conducting an experiment, varying requirements and noting responses in his journals. In January 1822, Stapleton introduced advanced requirements, starting with Danina. The new ritual required her to bring a small, personal, meaningful object from her cabin each morning. The first day, she brought a clay cup her husband Samuel had made. Stapleton placed it in a cabinet. "This will remain here," he said, "until you fail the ritual." The implication was clear. Her possessions were now held hostage. Over the next weeks, Danina brought a piece of cloth, a river stone, and a wooden spoon. She felt pieces of her life being archived, collected, and possessed. But she performed perfectly, and 30 days later, the clay cup was returned. The relief she felt terrified her that Disma's approval could generate such emotion. Other servants faced similar demands. Julia had to bring samples of her work. Thomas had to recite specific Bible passages with perfect inflection. Benjamin had to balance objects on his head while washing his feet. The requirements were designed to create a population in constant vigilance, never allowing their attention to waver. Danina noticed those who succeeded began to change. They moved with a precise, careful focus that seeped into every aspect of their behavior. Marcus, Danina's son, began his advanced requirements in March, memorizing complex mathematical sequences and reciting them during the ritual. He grew serious, focused, and obsessive. One evening, Marcus asked his mother, "Mama, do you ever wonder what he's trying to prove?" "He's studying us." Danina had suppressed the same dangerous question. Marcus theorized, "He's trying to see how much control he can have, not just over our bodies, but over our minds, over every single thing we do." The observation chilled Danina because it felt true. The ritual was about demonstrating Stapleton as absolute control and occupying their thoughts completely. In May, Stapleton introduced variable requirements, changing the rules daily to ensure constant anxiety. One day required counting in French, another demanded they hold their breath. The unpredictability was the point. On a humid morning in June, Danina found a new, horrifying requirement posted. Those entering must present a truth about themselves never before spoken aloud. Danina feared giving Stapleton power over something deeper than he already possessed. When her turn came, she stepped through the ritual and, facing east, confessed, "I remember every kindness anyone has ever shown me. Every single one." Stapleton deemed it sufficient, but Danina felt violated. He had taken something private and made it a condition of entry. Other servants faced similar demands, confessing their greatest fears and deepest shame. Each confession filed into Stapleton's notebooks. But something began to shift. The ritual designed to control and separate them began to foster unexpected solidarity. They shared the burden, practiced together, and supported one another through successes and failures, turning the impossible standards into a collective effort. They were united not in rebellion, but in collective survival of impossible standards. Then, in August, Stapleton expanded his experiment, selecting Ruth, Danina's 14-year-old daughter, for the advanced requirements. Danina was terrified. Knowing the ritual would introduce her young daughter to a psychological control she had hoped to spare her. Ruth's initial attempts were successful, but Stapleton quickly assigned her a cruel advanced requirement. She must bring samples of her cooking each morning, and only if his rating exceeded an arbitrary threshold would she be permitted entry. There were no clear standards. Ruth's success depended entirely on Stapleton's subjective judgment. Failures mounted. Ruth began to panic, becoming obsessed with her cooking, the same way others had become obsessed with counting. Danina watched her daughter deteriorate with helpless fury, knowing the ritual was breaking something in Ruth that might never repair. One September morning, Ruth presented a small cake made from hoarded ingredients. Stapleton tasted it. "Insufficient," he declared. "You may not enter today." Ruth stood frozen, tears sliding down her face. "Please," she whispered. "I can't do it perfectly. I can't make it exactly right every time. Nobody can." For a moment, surprise flickered across Stapleton's face, but it quickly hardened. "Tomorrow," he said, "I will require 2 dishes instead of 1. You will need to demonstrate improvement." That night, Danina knew resistance was necessary, but impossible. Refusal meant severe punishment or sale. Then Marcus came to their cabin with news that changed everything. Cleaning Stapleton's study, he had glimpsed the journals and read a crucial sentence. Subject compliance increases proportionally with ritual complexity, but subject psychological stability shows inverse correlation after threshold of 41 requirements. "He knows," Marcus whispered. "He knows the ritual is breaking people. He's measuring it. It's not madness. It's a deliberate experiment." The revelation was staggering. Stapleton was consciously studying their deterioration, treating human beings as objects of scientific inquiry. Marcus had also memorized another phrase. The question is not whether absolute compliance can be achieved, but whether subjects can be made to desire their own compliance. That phrase haunted Danina. Stapleton was trying to make them internalize the control, to make them want to perform perfectly, succeeding in driving Aaron to suicide and leaving others in perpetual anxiety. The next morning, Danina made a decision. She would fail the ritual deliberately to observe his response without immediate punishment. She performed every step perfectly, but at the last moment, she intentionally let her foot brush the door frame. Stapleton's pen hovered. "You have failed the threshold requirement," he said, but with a hint of curiosity. Danina apologized, feigning distraction due to Ruth's difficulties. "And what do you think about those difficulties?" Stapleton asks the first time he had ever asked such a question. Danina took the risk. "I think, sir, that she's trying as hard as she can. That sometimes trying isn't enough." "Precisely," Stapleton said. "Ego, that is precisely the point. Effort without result is meaningless. The ritual demands results." Danina pressed further. "But sir, some of the requirements change so frequently that success is partially a matter of chance." Stapleton's eyes sharpened. He wrote a long passage in his notebook, then did the unexpected. He gestured toward the interior of his house. "Come inside. We will continue this conversation in my study." Danina, having failed the ritual and yet invited in, followed him, her damp feet leaving prints on the polished floor. Danina followed Stapleton into his study, a room lined with journals and covered in papers. Stapleton, settling behind his desk, confirmed her exceptional performance. "You are the most consistent performer of the ritual. In 14 months, you have failed only once." He admitted his frustration that Thomas, though more educated, failed often, while Danina rarely did. "Why?" he asked. Danina chose honesty, sensing an opportunity. "I think, sir, it's because I don't believe the ritual means anything." Stapleton leaned forward. Danina explained that the others were trying to find rational purpose in the arbitrary demands, which created anxiety, but she performed it without conscious thought, simply focusing on the mechanics. Stapleton read from his journal, an entry from 8 months prior. "Subject to Danina demonstrates unusual psychological detachment. Hypothesis: perhaps the most effective control is achieved through creating such perfect indifference that subjects perform requirements automatically without conscious thought." "But that's not what's happened," Danina countered. "Everyone thinks about it constantly. Aaron died because he couldn't stop thinking about it." Stapleton showed a hint of regret, admitting Professor Lockheed had suggested he pushed the complexity too rapidly. "You could stop entirely," Danina said quietly. Stapleton stared at her, "But then I would learn nothing. The question that drives this research is fundamental. How much control can one human exert over another's mind? Not through violence, but through systematic psychological conditioning. If I can make you perform elaborate, meaningless tasks with perfect precision, I have demonstrated that human consciousness itself can be shaped and directed. But we're not water," Danina insisted. "We're people." Stapleton challenged her. "How do I know?" "In every legal sense, you are property. Yet you speak, you think, you apparently feel emotions similar to mine. The ritual helps me explore that paradox." Danina felt pure anger turn into cold, calculated understanding. "It suggests that survival sometimes requires performing what's demanded while keeping your true thoughts hidden. We understand the consequences of refusal and make calculated decisions about how to survive. That's not proof we lack consciousness. That's proof we possess it." Stapleton wrote rapidly, excitement evident. "Yes, exactly. Strategic performance, despite internal resistance. Lockheed calls it compliant consciousness." But he pressed her. "How long can that internal resistance persist? Will you forget that you once thought differently?" His words struck a painful truth. She had changed, performing automatically. The initial outrage slowly replaced by efficiency. "Return tomorrow," Stapleton concluded. "Perform the ritual correctly. We will continue these conversations. You're providing valuable data." Danina left the study, feeling she had become complicit in her own analysis. That night, Marcus returned with more disturbing information. He had found letters revealing Stapleton was corresponding with Professor Richard Lockheed at Harvard College about behavioral modification through systematic ritual. This entire experiment was planned 2 years ago, before Stapleton even arrived. So, we're not even his idea, Danina realized. We're part of someone else's theory. Marcus continued. I found a letter dated last month. It says Stapleton should look for spontaneous resistance as a sign that subjects have reached psychological capacity. When subjects begin to question the ritual openly, that's when the most interesting phase begins. The letter said, the subject who questions is the subject who has integrated the ritual deeply enough to recognize its mechanisms. Such subjects become invaluable for understanding the limits of conditioning. Danina felt cold. Her conversation with Stapleton that morning suddenly looked different. She had not challenged him. She had given him exactly what he was waiting for. Her resistance had become data. Marcus further revealed a letter where Stapleton described Aaron's suicide as a failure of the graduated complexity model, yet proof of the ritual-less capacity to create such profound psychological investment that subjects preferred death to continued failure. The clinical language describing Aaron's desperation made Danina's stomach turn. He's treating us like experiments in a laboratory, Marcos stated. He then revealed Stapleton was planning a demonstration in Charleston next month to show other planters how the ritual works, lecturing about conditioning and compliance. We're going to be exhibited like trained animals. Over the next weeks, Stapleton changed his approach with Danina, engaging her in long conversations, asking her opinion on requirements. It felt almost like respect. Yet she knew her critical thinking made her more valuable as a subject of close study. Stapleton was documenting how she maintained compliant consciousness. The shift in her role did not go unnoticed. Thomas approached her, asking pointedly, "Are you collaborating with him?" The accusation stung. Thomas warned her that every observation she shared was helping Stapleton refine his methods, making the ritual more effective. The words landed with brutal accuracy. Danina realized she had become complicit. Then we need to use that, she decided. If he's listening to what I say, then I can give him information that seems useful but actually weakens the ritual rather than strengthening it. She resolved to find a way to make him think he was achieving greater control while actually creating conditions for resistance. In October, Stapleton announced the Charleston demonstration. They understood they were not just subjects, but exhibits proof that human consciousness could be systematically shaped. They had no choice but to comply. Then, 3 days before the scheduled demonstration, Ruth approached Danina in the kitchen. "I'm going to speak," she said quietly. At the demonstration, she planned to tell the audience what the ritual really was. Danina was horrified, listing the inevitable punishment in sale. "What life?" Ruth interrupted, her voice weary with wisdom. "That's not a life worth protecting by staying silent. At least there will be one moment when someone told the truth in front of all those powerful men. At least they'll have to hear. Even if they don't listen, that matters, Mama. It has to matter." Danina, recognizing her own agency reflected in her daughter's determination, made a decision. Then we'll all speak. They would coordinate, making it impossible for Stapleton and his audience to dismiss the resistance as one person's madness. That night, the servants gathered in secret, practicing what they would say and timing their statements to build on each other's words. The Charleston demonstration took place on November 15, 1822, in the Grand Ballroom of the Planters Hotel. 73 planters and scientists attended, including Professor Lockheed from Harvard. The copper basin gleamed under the chandeliers. Stapleton stood beside a lectern, ready to present his research, the culmination of 2 years of work. Danina was scheduled to perform first, followed by Thomas, Julia, Benjamin, Marcus, and finally, Ruth. They understood perfectly what was expected of them. The Charleston demonstration took place on November 15, 1822, in the Grand Ballroom of the Planters Hotel. The copper basin gleamed under the chandeliers as Stapleton addressed the audience of 73 planters and scientists, including Professor Lockheed. "Gentlemen," he began, "what you are about to witness represents a breakthrough in the scientific management of enslaved labor. Physical punishment is inefficient. What I have developed is a system of psychological conditioning that creates compliance from within. Subjects learn to police themselves, to desire perfection in even arbitrary tasks. He gestured toward Danina. Subject Tadina has performed this ritual successfully 247 consecutive times. Danina approached the basin, her movements perfectly controlled despite the grand room and the watching eyes. She performed the foot washing, counted 230 with practiced clarity, and recited the phrases. She presented the clay cup her husband Samuel had made, explaining its significance as Stapleton had instructed. Its presence in my ritual represents my commitment to preserving what matters, despite circumstances beyond my control. The words felt like truth wrapped in lies. Her personal memory twisted into data for his thesis. Stapleton told the audience, "The precision is not the result of fear, but of genuine psychological integration. The ritual's power lies in its arbitrariness. When subjects can be made to perform meaningless tasks with perfect precision, you've achieved true control not over their bodies, but over their minds." Thomas then performed flawlessly, reciting the biblical passage, Ephesians 6-5. "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling." Stapleton lectured on how the model could be adapted to reinforce existing social structures. Julia followed, presenting her embroidery samples, while Stapleton discussed the fine motor control and ritualistic perfectionism that now extended into every aspect of her work. Benjamin and Marcus also completed their increasingly elaborate requirements without flaw. Professor Lockheed rose to ask about long-term psychological effects. Stapleton, with cold composure, lied to his peers. Initially, yes, there were some unfortunate outcomes, but current subjects showed remarkable psychological resilience. In fact, I would argue they demonstrate enhanced mental capacity. The ritual strengthens rather than weakens cognitive function. He did not mention Aaron's name or the tragedy of his death, reducing the human cost to a simple lesson about pacing. Then Ruth approached the basin for the final demonstration. Her movements were calm and deliberate. She counted to 30, recited the required phrases, and presented her 2 dishes, including the cake she had obsessively prepared. She explained, as instructed, how the ritual had taught her to strive for perfection and that her worth was measured by her masteress standards. Stapleton nodded approvingly, but the shift in Ruth's voice was unmistakable. "But there is something else the ritual has taught me," Ruth said, her voice carrying a sharp edge that made Stapleton stiffen. "It has taught me that cruelty can be disguised as science, that exploitation can be presented as improvement, that breaking human beings can be described as conditioning, as though we were horses or dogs, rather than people with thoughts and feelings as complex as any of yours." Stapleton moved toward her, his face darkening. "You will be silent." "I am being honest, as the ritual requires," Ruth insisted, not moving from the basin. "Your purpose is to demonstrate that people like me can be controlled so completely that we forget we are human, that we come to judge ourselves by your standards. That's what this demonstration is really showing you. Not that the ritual works, but that you can make people participate in their own degradation. If you make the requirements complicated enough, you can make them practice their submission until it looks like skill. You can measure and document and analyze their responses until their suffering becomes data in your journals. But you cannot make them believe your justifications. You cannot make them forget they're human." The room had gone completely silent. Stapleton grabbed Ruth's arm, but Marcus, Danina, Thomas, Julia, and Benjamin instantly stepped forward, forming a solid, silent barrier between Ruth and immediate violence. Danina spoke, addressing the audience directly. "We perform your rituals because the alternative is worse. But don't mistake our performance for acceptance. Don't mistake our compliance for belief. We understand exactly what you're doing." Thomas continued, "Exposing the truth. You talk about psychological conditioning as though it's a scientific breakthrough, but what you've really discovered is how to make people hate themselves for failing to meet standards that were designed to be almost impossible." Julia challenged Stapleton, arguing their speech was not insubordination, but a demonstration of the ritual is a true effect. Benjamin spoke last. his quiet voice detailing the lasting physical damage. "My hands shake now. They never did before. You never considered that the data you're collecting represents actual human suffering." The room erupted in chaos. Professor Lockheed, his face furious, declared the demonstration a failure of the fundamental methodology. Then, Benjamin Lundy, an older Quaker and publisher of The Genius of Universal Emancipation, rose from the back of the room. "This demonstration has proven something quite profound," he stated. "These people, ... remain capable of clear analysis and articulate resistance. That does not suggest failure of conditioning. It suggests the inherent impossibility of truly destroying human consciousness through ritual compliance." Lundy declared he would write about the experiments and share the servant's testimony with readers across the country. The demonstration ended in disarray. Stapleton gathered his house servants with cold fury. The journey back to Hartwell Landing was silent. Upon arrival, Stapleton immediately forced them to perform the ritual, despite their exhaustion, and they completed it with mechanical precision. Once they were done, Stapleton announced the calculated punishment. "Ruth will be sold. I have already sent word to a buyer in Georgia who specializes in purchasing difficult slaves. Furthermore, her sale price would be deducted from the food rations of all house servants for the next 12 months, ensuring they would resent her resistance." Stapleton affirmed the ritual would continue, with new, more complex requirements, to eliminate the capacity for resistance they had just demonstrated. In devastated silence, the servants gathered that night. They had no power to stop Ruth's sale, but they could honor her action. "You proved that understanding what's being done to you is itself a form of resistance. That naming it matters," Danina told her daughter. Marcus promised. "We'll tell the story to others. We'll make sure that anyone who comes to Hartwell Landing understands what the ritual really is, what it's really for." Ruth was sold the next morning to a buyer named Crawford Pettigrew for a brutal turpentine plantation in Georgia. Danina watched her daughter leave, feeling something harden in her chest. Ruth's speech had not stopped the ritual, but it had created a moment of truth. A refusal to participate in the fiction that their compliance indicated acceptance. That had to count for something. The ritual at Hartwell Landing continued, growing more elaborate with each passing month. By spring of 1823, the requirements numbered 57. By 1825, 63. Stapleton never mentioned the Charleston demonstration again, retreating entirely into documentation. He observed and recorded their performances without attempting to understand the consciousness behind their compliance. Professor Lockheed stopped corresponding, the academic community deeming the research too controversial. But Stapleton continued, driven by an obsessive need to prove that absolute psychological control was possible. Benjamin Lundy published an article about the Charleston demonstration in the June 1823 issue of The Genius of Universal Emancipation. He described the ritual, quoted Ruth's speech extensively, and raised questions about the elaborate psychological manipulation performed in the name of agricultural efficiency. While the article generated discussion among abolitionists in the North, in South Carolina, it changed nothing if anything. It made conditions worse as Stapleton grew more determined to prove his theories. The servants adapted. They continued performing the ritual, helping one another master new requirements. But they developed a collective memory of Ruth's resistance, passing down her words to newer members of the community. Danina performed the ritual faithfully for 26 years until Stapleton's death in 1847. By then, the ritual had become so ingrained in her daily movements that, even years later, she found herself counting to 30 under her breath before entering buildings, feeling phantom water around her feet, and reciting the meaningless phrases. When Stapleton died, his journals and research notes were sealed by his lawyer, who deemed them too disturbing for public consumption. 3 researchers who later gained access suffered severe mental disturbances, what historians now understand were likely moral breakdowns from confronting the calculated cruelty documented in Stapleton's meticulous notes. The main house at Hartwell Landing burned in 1849 under unexplained circumstances. The fire destroyed the ritual basin, reducing the copper to a melted lump. But the document listing the 47 original rules survived in the courthouse archives. That single page, which officials tried 3 times to burn, remains a testament to humanity's capacity for both elaborate cruelty and stubborn resistance. Danina lived until 1862, dying at the age of 82 without ever seeing Ruth again. Marcus lived until 1871, working as a carpenter and telling stories about his mother's courage to his children. Thomas spent his later years documenting oral histories of enslavement, including detailed accounts of the ritual at Hartwell Landing. Lundy's newspaper articles became source material for later abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass, who cited Stapleton's ritual in his speeches as an example of slavery's psychological cruelties. The story spread, becoming part of the larger narrative about how human consciousness resisted, even under conditions designed to destroy it. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe to the Forgotten Liturgy, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark historical mysteries. The past holds secrets more disturbing than any fiction, and we'll continue uncovering them together. Until the next video, remember, the past holds secrets more disturbing than any fiction, and we'll continue uncovering them together.